Lord Acton, the British historian, once said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. History is replete with leaders who have been corrupted by their political power and have abused their people. Americans enjoy the liberties of democracy today because the framers of our constitutional system, men like James Madison, George Mason, George Washington, learned how to control power and how to curb the natural tendency of people to abuse power. And they learned it by borrowing many ideas about power and its abuse from those who came before them. Ideas like the rule of law, the separation of powers, a Bill of Rights. The evolution of our Constitution was not simple and was not without its share of pain and tyranny. But what evolved was a system which enabled us to govern ourselves. The story you are about to see is the gripping drama of how the people of England and America fought off the grasp of tyranny for 6 centuries to form what became the world's longest surviving democracy.
Attention! Dropping it! Ready! Stop! Fire! Ah! Oh! Oh!
No one knows for certain who fired the first shot in Lexington on that April morning over 200 years ago. Some think it was an overzealous British officer. Others say it was a colonist near the edge of the green. But when it was all over, 8 Minutemen lay dead. What desperation could have driven colonists who'd considered themselves Englishmen for over 150 years to take up arms against their brothers? Well, a year after Lexington, the colonists explained their reasons. In a document they sent to England, addressed to King George, they objected to, quote, quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, imposing taxes on us without our consent, and depriving us of the benefits of a trial by jury. That document was the Declaration of Independence. The story that started on Lexington Green is a story of power and the abuse of power. Like any exciting drama, the story is full of conflict, greed, passion, intrigue, corruption, and violence. But it is also the story of the Founding Fathers' hope that by the correct distribution of power, we as citizens might be better guardians of it. In more than 200 years as a nation, we've become the world's longest surviving democracy. To make this possible, the men who designed our government dug deep into the past to borrow a wealth of ideas about individual liberty and law and power. And they applied those ideas in a way that would prevent abuse of power by would-be tyrants. Well, for most Americans, the story of our nation's founding begins with the first battle of the Revolutionary War on the Green at Lexington. But the real story begins nearly 800 years ago on the outskirts of London in a swampy field called Runnymede.
A damp swamp would seem an unlikely meeting place for the King of England and 39 powerful barons. One might expect such a distinguished group to collect in the regal comfort of nearby Windsor Castle. But then the purpose of this meeting was hardly cordial. It was a meeting under truce, and the meadow at Runnymede provided some military advantage to both sides in case the proceedings came to blows. The barons were not happy with King John, and for good reason. In his 16 years on the throne, he had bled his subjects with outrageous taxes, seized their land and possessions, practiced his own peculiar brand of justice, and in other ways violated the principles under which they'd been accustomed to living. To John, power meant he could do just about anything he pleased, and no one dared to stop him. Though he was king, John was not exactly an ideal role model. Unlike his brother, Richard the Lionhearted, John wasn't very adept at warfare. He was never seen leading his troops into battle. Under his command, England's army lost most of the country's holdings in France. In fact, his miserable record had earned him the nickname John Softsword. Since then, no other member of England's royal family has ever been named John. In 1215, John wanted to go off on another military expedition, and he needed the barons' help to do it. But they'd had enough of his arbitrary ways. They refused to support him unless he agreed to their demands. The barons listed their demands in what would come to be the most famous document in English history, Magna Carta, meaning Great Charter. Many of its provisions tackled issues which were relevant only to 13th century England, but others have a strikingly modern ring. Among the demands of the barons were provisions that the king could not take their property without compensation or consent, justice of the court shall be available to everyone, and that punishments should fit the crime. As much as he must have hated the idea, John agreed to the barons' demands, and those demands were duly recorded in the Great Charter. Had he not died a year later, they say from glutting on peaches and cider, Magna Carta would probably not have survived. But in the centuries ahead, Magna Carta came to symbolize far more than the barons could possibly have imagined. It started a process that would bring welcome changes to English government in the centuries to follow. In various forms, its principles would be reissued again and again. The law of the land, due process of law. The idea that governments do not have unlimited power. The idea that people have the right to live their lives without fear of unjust persecution. The idea that people in power must follow the same set of rules as everyone else. And that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
By the start of the 17th century, English government had changed quite a bit. Gradually, a new concept was emerging, representative government. It consisted of a House of Lords, which represented the nobility, and a House of Commons representing everyone else. Together they were called Parliament, which means the talking place. In those ancient times, Parliament met throughout the kingdom wherever the king happened to be. But often they met here in London at Westminster. But for the most part, the monarchs and Parliament got along well enough. And then along came the Stuarts. In 1603, a Scottish king, James I, ascended to the throne of England. It was the beginning of the Stuart dynasty, and what a beginning. On the way from Edinburgh to his coronation in London, James ordered a pickpocket to be hanged on the spot without a trial, a display of royal power that hinted darkly of the trouble to come. James believed the source of his power was quite clear.
The state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods.
James would go on to tell Parliament that he had the right to break the law for the common good. And of course, he would decide what was the common good. But the real trouble with the Stuarts was just beginning. When James died, his son Charles I inherited the throne, and not surprisingly, a hostile Parliament.
Although a frail man, Charles wasted little time in wielding the powers of the crown. He imposed taxes without Parliament's consent, forced citizens to house soldiers in their homes. He threw people into jail without trial. Many never returned. More than once, his subjects would remind Charles that not even kings were above the law. In 1628, Parliament presented him with the Petition of Right, asking him to honor their ancient rights as set forth in Magna Carta over 400 years before. Charles had consented to their demands then because he needed Parliament to raise the money for his war with Spain and France. But soon after they agreed, he dissolved Parliament and ruled England without them for more than a decade. 11 years later, Charles found himself embroiled in yet another war, and again, desperate for money, called on Parliament to reassemble and get him the funds. But this time they let him know there was some unfinished business.
Who are these men? I would know by what authority I am called to these matters. I am their lawful king. The honor and safety of the kingdom is at stake. Nothing less. Yet these rogues work to dissolve the foundations of the monarchy.
Parliament's list of demands was specific.
No tallage or aid should be...
All taxes imposed by the king without parliamentary consent would be null and void.
Earls, barons, knights,
The king could no longer dissolve Parliament without its consent, and he would have to call Parliament for regular sessions.
The calling or dissolving of parliaments is the king's prerogative. My prerogative. As I find the fruits of them good or evil, they are to continue or not to be.
This time, Parliament wasn't listening. So Charles reluctantly agreed to their demands, and they gave him his war money. But what do you do when promises are broken?
I am their lawful king.
That's what Parliament faced when, true to character, Charles once again took the money and quickly returned to his old tricks, doing just as he pleased.
With all his broken promises, dissension between Charles and Parliament grew. Fearing for the lives of his family and his own, Charles moved his court from London to York and continued to negotiate from there. But eventually, talks failed. Parliament's final answer to Charles' abuse of power was rebellion. In August of 1642, under the command of Oliver Cromwell, commoner, parliamentary forces entered the battlefield against the King's army. England's first civil war had begun. Driven by Cromwell's military genius, the parliamentary army defeated Charles and took him captive. Charles stood trial at Westminster for treason. On January 27, 1649, the court passed sentence.
Charles Stuart, as tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body.
The liberty and freedom of the people consist in having a government. It is not for having a share in government. A subject and a sovereign are clear different things. I have a good cause and a gracious God. I will say no more.
To kill a king. How staggering it must have been to people of the 17th century. It certainly was to the executioner. He died 6 months later, lamenting his part in the deed and claiming to have seen apparitions and visions. First Oliver Cromwell and then his son governed England under military rule for the next 11 years. Some historians believe that he did his best to preserve the country's constitutional government, and others think that he was becoming a tyrant himself towards the end. Some even think he was going mad. After years of erratic rule and deteriorating conditions under the Cromwells, the English people were anxious to return to a form of government more familiar to them. They wanted another king. And who did they choose to restore to the throne? Well, following strict lines of succession, they chose another Stuart, Charles II, the son of the very man that they'd executed.
This Charles was known as the Merry Monarch, and he put more energy into ridding the court of its stark Puritan trappings than he did into matters of government. As for Parliament, he could get along with it or without it. He just never thought much about it. But there were those who did. Among them, the brilliant philosopher and writer John Locke. Locke believed that government is a contract, a binding agreement between the ruler and the ruled. That all people have, quote, natural rights to life, liberty, and property. But to make certain that the rights of one don't interfere with the rights of others, men agree to limit their rights by setting up government.
The only way one divests himself of his natural liberty is by agreeing with other men to join into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceful living.
Locke believed that people consent to be governed. It is the people who lend their power to the government. And if the government abuses that power, the people have the right to take it back.
Whenever that end is neglected or opposed, the trust must be forfeited, and the power dissolve into the hands of those that gave it.
And that's exactly what the American colonists would later say to King George in the Declaration of Independence. You have failed to govern us properly, therefore we take back the power of government that we lent to you.
With the death of the merry monarch, the crown passed to yet another steward, James II. Like Charles, James II had no regard for Parliament. He thought it a nuisance and declared he would rule without it. For the English, it was an all too familiar story. Would England be forever ruled by an endless line of Stuart kings? An unhappy thought. So the Bishop of London and 6 laymen took it upon themselves to invite, secretly, the ruler of the Netherlands, William of Orange, to bring his army and protect the English people from their own king. William agreed to the plan, and when he landed with his troops, the English army deserted James and the deposed monarch fled to France. Not a single shot was fired, and England's second revolution came to be known as the Bloodless or Glorious Revolution. The grateful country offered William and his wife Mary the throne. But this time there were strings attached. This time Englishmen were going to be sure that whoever sat on the throne understood the limits on royal powers before they got the job. A document was drawn up to specify the terms by which England would be governed. It said in part that no laws were to be made or suspended unless Parliament approved. No taxes were to be levied without the consent of Parliament. Trials must have juries. It was lawful to keep arms, and that elections to Parliament must be free. To the joy of the kingdom, William and Mary consented to the terms of this document. John Locke might have called it a social contract, but the English people simply called it their Bill of Rights.
What an extraordinary century it was for England. Civil war, a king beheaded, military rule, and recurrent strife. And yet, while all that was going on, Englishmen were spawning colonies an ocean away, emigrating to the New World and carrying with them English laws and customs, and some firm ideas about government and the rights of English citizens. After the Glorious Revolution, England was on a course that would lead to a supreme parliament, while in the New World, Englishmen would travel a very different path.
Many of the early settlers to the colonies worked for the commercial interests of English companies. but they were so far away from England that they needed to set up local governments, and documents called charters gave them the right to do so. Significantly, every single charter contained a clause assuring the colonists all the privileges, franchises, and immunities of Englishmen. But, as we've seen, making promises is one thing, honoring them is something else. Before long, royal governors were arbitrarily making up laws and dishing out punishments, running government as they saw fit.
William Sherman. Heed well my words. William Sherman, resident of this town, who disorderly taken of tobacco along the King his highway, contrary to the acts and orders of the court, is censured to be set to the stocks for the space of 2 hours. Sentence is to be carried out immediately. Set Goodman Sherman to the stocks.
Colonists were learning quickly that it wasn't just kings who got carried away with power.
Mark well, good neighbours, this example of justice done, and profit by it.
It was a new country, but a familiar old story. By the 1700s, colonists in America, now including Englishmen, Scots, Irish, Swedes, Germans, Dutch, and others, were emerging from the primitive conditions of wilderness living. Trade and commerce blossomed in cities north and south: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. The 18th century provided opportunity for many. The future promised wealth and greatness. And though the majority of colonists were still loyal English citizens, they were enjoying self-governance and getting better at it. But power in these times, as set forth in English law, was narrowly defined. Sadly and ironically, much of the New World's growth and prosperity rested in part on the labor and the blood of thousands of imported black slaves. For them, the road to liberty and just government would be longer and much more painful.
Until the mid-1700s, England paid little attention to her colonies. She'd been busy building an empire, waging one war after another since the Glorious Revolution. And then in 1754, a new battlefront opened up as England went to war with the French and Indians over a disputed territory in what is now western Pennsylvania.
The colonists agreed to help the English troops in the fight. In fact, the first skirmish of the war involved a young colonial officer named George Washington. He lost that battle. The British eventually won the war, but at what a price. They wound up heavily in debt. Their victory brought new territory under the Empire's rule, territory that would have to be defended and maintained. And who was going to pay for that?
Parliament reasoned that since the British Army was in North America to defend the colonists, why shouldn't they, the colonists, pay their fair share of the cost? So Parliament decided to tax the colonies.
Over the next few years, these taxes increased steadily. Tea, glass, paper, lead, paint, even playing cards.
McNally!
At first, the colonists did little more than complain. But feelings were rising, and Parliament would soon discover how strongly the colonists felt.
Mr. McNally, pint of ale, if you please.
Yes, Mr. McNally. Your Highness.
Put it on the king's tab.
The king.
Sugar tax, coffee tax, wine tax. What is next, gents? On His Majesty's list. That which you sit upon. And perhaps the bench beneath it.
'Tis not the king who warrants your wrath, but Parliament, for the taxes are there.
Some say taxes are just. Then they be fools.
Aye. We are not bound by a Parliament in which we have no say.
No, nor by a king who will not listen. King of Parliament, it matters not. My salute is the same. To hell with their taxes.
Parliament's efforts to punish the colonists only pushed them closer to unity. They boycotted English goods, tarred and feathered tax collectors, destroyed property. The tide was rising, and the colonies were soon flooded with pamphlets, declarations, resolves, and speeches. The recurrent theme that the colonists were Englishmen and should be guaranteed the same rights as Englishmen back home.
And the news of Boston, sir.
More tax collectors are arriving from the mother country with more troops dispatched to protect them.
More citizens compelled to house them, no doubt.
A fair assumption, I should think. That is their general practice.
By what right? Every day brings news of some new offense. They forget that we're Englishmen.
That is what our General Assembly and others are resolved to remind them. But their work is in vain, gentlemen, unless we attend to ours, and at this moment, 2 of you are not.
History-minded colonists may have been reminded of something else by all the taxes Parliament imposed and the means it used to enforce them. It brought to mind past English kings who had wielded power, limited only by their own self-restraint, or lack of it. Like the royal subjects of 17th century England, the colonists looked back to ancient rights and charters, beginning with Magna Carta, to support their claims.
We are still loyal subjects to the crown, they declare. So let's remember our agreement between government and the governed. Resolved, that by 2 royal charters granted by King James I, the colonists are entitled to all liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities as if they had been abiding and born within the realm of England. The Virginia Stamp Act resolutions of 1765. By 1775, the situation had become intolerable. Parliament had taken over the courts, forced colonists to house British troops in their homes, and conducted illegal searches. Protest hadn't worked, and some colonial leaders suggested a different option. In Virginia, at the Capitol in Williamsburg, the fiery orator Patrick Henry made it perfectly clear what that option was.
Mr. President, it is natural for a man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth. But are we disposed to be of the number of those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not the things that so nearly concern their temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it might cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging the future but by the past. And judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the last 10 years to justify hopes for peace and reconciliation. Sir, let us not deceive ourselves longer. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we have so long contended, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight!
The call was answered, and the break with England began outside Boston at Lexington.
During the 7 years that Americans were battling the British, the rebellious colonies were forming new state governments, suited, they thought, to their needs as free and independent states. In Virginia, Patrick Henry had spoken of the lamp of experience as their guide. His wisdom may still have echoed in the halls of the Capitol in Williamsburg, where the Virginia Convention in 1776 used the light of history from both English and American lamps to design their new government. Attending the convention were some of the finest political minds of the period. Among them, James Madison, who would later become the father of the U.S. Constitution. And this man, George Mason, who became the principal architect of the Virginia Constitution. The first order of business, to instruct the Virginia delegates to the Continental Congress to propose that the colonies declare independence from England.
I am very hopeful, sir.
Once having declared this independence, the responsibility then fell to Mason to compose a Declaration of Rights. And the document that George Mason ultimately produced became the basis for the American Bill of Rights as we know it today. George Mason was a student of history. He had studied Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, and the English Bill of Rights. And in writing the Virginia Declaration, Mason proposed many of those principles which Englishmen before him had claimed as their ancient rights. But his work went beyond those ancient documents in several innovative ways. For one, it spelled out a political theory. John Locke's theory on where government's power came from.
Men being by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be subjected to the political power of another without his consent.
That all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any...
But government can never have a power to take to themselves the subject's property without their consent.
That men cannot be taxed or deprived of their property for public uses without their own consent or that of their representatives so elected, nor bound by any law to which they have not in like manner assented for the public good.
Though he borrowed much from past English ideas, George Mason took the ideas embodied in English common law an important step further.
Article 2. That all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. That magistrates are their trustees and servants and at all times amenable to them. That government is...
Power flows from the people. Government officials are the public servants. Now, there were some ideas never made explicit in past English documents. And there was more.
Article 5. That the legislative and executive powers of the state should be separate and distinct from the judiciary, and that members of the two first may be restricted.
Separation of powers. A plan to help prevent the abuse of power. If the powers are equally distributed, but in those first American state constitutions, they weren't.
Who will speak on this matter, let him rise and be recognized. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Accomack County.
Mr. Speaker, I must take strong acceptance.
It would take some time for Americans to realize that even their own legislatures could abuse power.
State constitutions were still far from perfect, but the framers were learning from their successes and failures, and their experiences with state constitution writing then were to be the laboratory for building a new nation. Unlike the English Parliament, which had no limits on power other than its own self-restraint, Americans would create written limits on the power of their state legislatures and would gradually begin using the courts to enforce those limits. Englishmen in America had arrived at a fork in the road from Runnymede.
Under the pressures of war, there was no denying the need to unify the nation formally. So, while the individual states were busy writing their own constitutions, the Second Continental Congress had been drafting one for the nation. Still, knowing how wary most colonists were of central government, they had approached their task cautiously. What they created was called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. The term perpetual would turn out to be optimistic at best.
Gentlemen.
Under these articles, Congress was allowed the few powers it had already assumed to carry out the war, but not much more. It couldn't directly tax the citizens. It had no executive branch, no president to enforce its laws. It had no authority to establish national courts. It couldn't even maintain a national army unless the state said so. The colonists had found a sure way to keep a government from abusing its power, all right. They simply didn't give it very much support. In fact, barely enough to conduct the war.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Congress didn't even have the power to require the states to supply equipment and troops. So many only contributed what was convenient. And usually it was when the fighting moved closer to their own backyard. Then they became more willing to help out. But in spite of that, and after 7 long years of bloodshed, George Washington and the Continental Army managed to defeat the British. Americans had won their independence. Ironically, it was only the war for independence that had held the colonies together. When the war ended, what unity there had been among the states soon fell apart. Legislatures ran amok, canceling debts, regulating trade, issuing reams of paper money. So much, in fact, that inflation soared. Some states went into a deep depression.
I will say this one more time, and this is final, gentlemen. I order you to disperse. Your assembly here is unlawful. You're disrupting the court of session.
No! The court that has disrupted us, our lives, but no longer.
If they cannot meet, they cannot foreclose our farm. I have given you fair warning.
What troubles the Honorable Sheriff? That you will lose your fee if the court cannot meet?
Yes. What is your fee, Sheriff? Much do you charge to evict rebellious farmers from a courthouse? As much as to evict them from their farms?
Certainly it is not so handsome a sum as the good sheriff commands for executions.
If you think the fee for execution's excessive, fear not. For I shall hang you. All. At no charge. With the greatest of pleasure.
Americans were learning quickly just how difficult self-government could be. And they were finding out that state legislatures could be as arbitrary as anyone else. Many believe that the country's only hope lay in giving greater powers to the central government. Among those believers, George Washington, revolutionary hero and the most revered man in America. In one of his private letters, Washington confided,
"We have probably had too good an opinion of human nature in forming our confederation. I do not conceive we can exist long as a nation without having lodged somewhere a power which will pervade the whole Union."
Not everyone shared Washington's sentiments. To many of the colonists, centralized government meant tyranny, abuse of power, and they'd had their fill of that under English kings and Parliament and state legislatures. But as the disunity grew in the Confederation, as state governments continued to make a general mess of things, granting more power to a national government began to look better and better. And so the Continental Congress authorized a convention to be held here in Philadelphia in the summer of '87. Every state, except Rhode Island, sent a delegation. Their mandate? To patch up the Articles of Confederation. But many of them knew that wasn't the solution. The ailing nation needed something better. A brand new constitution. And they'd discover that even that wouldn't be enough. The people would demand that the Constitution have a Bill of Rights, because they'd learned well that any government, even a democratic one, could abuse power.
Will the gentleman from New Jersey yield? Shall New Jersey, with 5 votes, have the same right of influence in the council?
At that point, Americans had taken as much as they wanted to take from their British heritage. They'd learned that rights and liberties are fragile and need protection. You have to put limits on power and make those limits perfectly clear. In writing. That no one's above the law. That the power of government comes from its citizens. What began at Runnymede has changed in many ways. From the British system and its parliament to the American Constitution. Mileposts on the road from Runnymede.
but by no means the end.
Our program, The Road from Runnymede, is based on a book by A.E. Dick Howard, professor of law at the University of Virginia, and a consultant to governments around the world on constitutional issues. Dick, it's been 800 years since King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta. What matter should it make to us now?
The problem now, as it was then, is the problem of power. Who has it? How much they have? Will they abuse it? What do you do about it if they do? One of the central problems of government, it seems to me, is to give government enough power to do the things it has to do its job, and at the same time put some kind of limits on that power so that the rights of the individual are not abused. And that's a very contemporary problem.
Well, what do you think the greatest legacy of the Magna Carta is? Is it that men and women have natural rights that kings can't take away?
The thing that matters most to us is that everyone, governors and governed alike, are subject to the law. That the rules of the game bind people in power as well as those who have to live under them. I think the tendency to abuse power is something that every generation is stuck with. Even people who have good intentions. They may be idealists, they may be acting, they think, for the good of other people, they can still abuse power. That was what the barons were trying to get King John to do, and that's what we still worry about today.
Have the principles that were in the Magna Carta and are in our Constitution been applied successfully in any other parts of the world, or is it just an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon?
I think you would find in countries that aspire to constitutional democracy, for example, the countries of Eastern Europe, countries in Southern Africa, other parts of the world, one finds that the central questions that Magna Carta and its progeny have dealt with, questions such as fairness, equality, access to the courts, remedies for abuse, all of those issues are the very things that constitution makers and builders of democratic institutions are obliged to deal with any place, any time.
Do you think the United States has succeeded in curbing the natural tendency among politicians to abuse power?
One of the great secrets of our system of government is that our founders drew very heavily upon the legacy of what came before. They tapped English history, they delved into the teachings of the Enlightenment, they looked at the experience of the ancient and modern world, but then they went about adding to it. And I think one of the secrets of American government is that over the centuries since the framing of our Constitution, each generation has brought its own insights to bear, and we have added something to the world's store of knowledge about dealing with power. Principles like separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, all of these are things which Americans, I think, have added something to.
So you take the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the amendments to the Constitution form the framework, but those are not self-enforcing. It takes something more to make that machinery run smoothly. What more does it take?
Citizen education and citizens' commitment. In a constitutional democracy, of course you have to limit power, but the people themselves finally have to breathe life into democratic institutions, and that takes a constant revisiting of basic issues, what George Mason once called a frequent recurrence to fundamental principle.
Thank you, Professor Howard, for that brief trip on the road from Runnymede. I'm Roger Mudd.